Hello, dear audience. We are back with our topic, and Presbyter Kyriaki and I will be discussing this small prayer that originated from Mother Teresa's experience in India. She wrote this as a business card and shared with many people, and I'm sure that it became life-changing experience for many people. And the prayer is: a sacrifice to be real must cost, must hurt, must empty ourselves. The fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. The fruit of service is peace. I found the summary of this: prayer, faith, love, and action are what society needs for joy and peace. And if we generate these four realities in our lives, we'll be ahead towards peace and joy in our lives that come as a result of sacrifice that we find in the beginning of the prayer. Last time we spoke about the first line: a sacrifice to be real must cost, must hurt, must empty ourselves. We quite thoroughly went through this line, and now we're going to go ahead with the second line, which is: the fruit of silence is prayer, and discuss few realities, main ideas. Silence that generates prayer. Now, why doesn't the prayer generate silence? Why she says that silence is the one that generates the prayer, not the opposite way? Maybe the opposite will be true too. So, Dr. Kyriaki, thank you again and again, and let's talk about the silence that generates prayer. This just came to my mind. Why not prayer to silence, but silence to prayer? Can't we just start praying and then all of a sudden we'll become silent and then we'll go ahead from that point? Do we have to be silent to be able to pray?
The kind of silence you're talking about is a kind of silence that's connected to being still, stillness, so we can listen. Mm-hmm. Where there are no other distractions calling our attention from that which we want to do, which is pray. And what is prayer? It's our turning our attention, our turning our hearts, our love, and our connectedness to God, the other with a capital O, the big other. In Greek, the word for prayer, and we've talked about that before, is the word prosephi. And many people who speak Greek will understand the word prosephi to mean prayer. But when you break down the term for prayer in Greek, it literally means standing in the presence of, or implying standing well, standing in a good way, in a happy way, in a connected way with the other. And so that connecting, that active connection, is telling us what real prayer is about, as opposed to just talking. Sometimes we can talk at God or give God a laundry list, and there's no heart there. It's just sort of we're giving our order to the haphazard waiter or waitress. Now, that's not prayer. That's not prosephi. Right? And so getting back to the beginning of that line, the fruit of silence is prayer. It would benefit us to reflect more on what that means, to be still, to be receptive, to be open, to take our attention away from all the chatter and the noise that surrounds us all the time, so that we can connect in prayer. Now remember, when I see these words of this simple, beautiful little prayer that Mother Teresa wrote, we have to remember that the kind of work that she was doing, that for decades she was serving the destitute and the poor, that she was helping her sisters, her nuns, and that there were orders of religious monks and priests and lay people and professionals who were dedicating their lives along with her to help the destitute and the poor, not only in the slums of Calcutta, but this has flowered and blossomed to many places all over the world. And so, and the kind of giving that occurs in these places is unconditional, to the point of, I'm stupefied. I am stupefied how some of these wonderful people would leave rather comfortable existences, would give up potential greatness in academia or business or the medical fields or in some other field, and set aside their lives and join this movement of helping the destitute and the poor, either by becoming a Roman Catholic sister or brother dedicated just to this, or a lay person surrendering everything. And so we have to think about all the people with whom she ministered, who collaborated with her, but to whom, in a sense, they were in obedience, as well as the people that she herself touched day after day on her own, going to the places where they dumped garbage and would find people thrown there along with the garbage, and to rescue them from the garbage piles and try to give them a dignified end. And so when we just have a tiny taste in our imagination of what kind of life this was, so that she could give glory to God through this stranger who for her is Christ, whoever he or she may be. For her, that person was Christ. And so for her to start a prayer toward the end of her life with this line, this is one of the first lines, the fruit of silence is prayer. As she's in the middle of this hubbub, as she's in the middle of this chaos and noise and pollution of downtown Calcutta, causes us to be quiet and be still.
She was obviously a person of prayer, and she found that silence to begin to pray. And sometimes when we think about silence, we think about a remote area where we are away from everything and there is natural silence. I remember one episode from Little House on the Prairie by Michael Landon, where he brings his family back from the town to his old small house on the top of the hill. And when they go in, there are web cobs everywhere, and the house is dirty and dusty, and everybody starts looking for familiar things. And he says, stop, everybody stop, don't talk, listen, just listen. And they start listening. They're thinking of some bird singing or a cricket or something wonderful to listen to. And then the smallest kid says, Father, there is nothing to listen. And he says, that's what I mean. It's quiet. That's what we need to listen to the quiet. We have missed this silence in the town where there was all kinds of noise, fight, drunk people. And so there is this kind of silence.
It's restorative.
Mm-hmm.
When even in that television show, Little House on the Prairie, which took place in another century, so
Yes.
they didn't have to worry about all the toys we have, the enormous new number of toys that we have to play with that take our attention away from other things, sometimes necessary things. And even there, he was craving silence, that there was noise in the town, challenging them to give them their attention. And so this kind of silence, which is exactly what the story is talking about, is that kind of stillness, the kind of listening. It's the closet Jesus talked about. Enter your closet. If you want to pray to God the Father, go into your closet and pray. So it's that quiet place where you are not listening and you are cut off from all the other voices that are jibber-jabbering away trying to get your attention, and be God with a small g in our lives. And so that we can be still and listen. Now, what you're describing also, which we need to emphasize in prayer, is, yes, we talk about prayer being work, turning our attention around and facing that connection we desire to make with God. We have to rest in the silence. The silence is also a place of rest. And maybe that's also a hint in how we pray to God. Yes, we'll pray to God when we're anxious. I do. We'll pray to God, hopefully, when we're agitated. That's a good thing, because if I'm agitated, my attention's someplace else. It's the beginning of dethroning whatever is giving me my agitation and trying to turn toward God. So that's a good thing, even when I'm agitated or fearful, to turn to God. That's really all good. It's especially good when we strive to be more open to the love of God, to find a place of rest in us where it's quiet, so that we can listen better. In our first discussion on this prayer, you gave a story quoting Anthony Bloom, Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, I'm not sure, but you said something about he was instructing a woman who wanted to learn how to pray to do something she loves to do, which was knitting, and to be very quiet and still as she knit, just so that even just to hear the knitting needles hit each other, even the thread moving from one part of the fabric to the rest, to hear that was the beginning of prayer. So what he was doing, he was deliberately guiding her to do something she enjoyed that helped her go to a quiet, silent place that's full. It's not empty, it's a full place where she could be receptive and to take in the love of God that's all around her.
What would you suggest to a modern person who is spending most of his or her life in a car, under stoplights, in a workplace, there's music that you don't want to listen? What would you suggest this kind of person? I'll give you a small example from a monastic life. When they come out of the church where they were praying, everybody, all the monks, start talking to each other. And one of them starts running and says, "Run, run, run, everybody run." It was as if some hurricane was coming. And when he does this, everybody's like alerted. They say, "Run from what? What's happening?" And he points to his tongue and says, "Run from your tongues, run from your tongues." And he runs into his cell. Now, in a modern society, we don't even have that mandatory silence where we have to pray, except Sunday, maybe 1 hour. The rest of the time, we're immersed into this noisy, chaotic movement where we have to be part of it. Sometimes when I'm at work, I miss home. That's all. When I go home, my wife says, "Let's go somewhere here, there." I just want to be home. I don't want to go anywhere.
I have so much fun with you, Arkady, because something came to me which I'd never thought of before, especially when you said when you go to your day job and you're, let's say, at the store, you're a manager, and you've got the customers, you've got music booming, you've got the people coming over the PA system, you know, making announcements. You've got to keep an eye out for people who pilfer. You know, you've said a few stories in the past here about what can happen at a typical, the retail place at which you manage. And what came to me was sometimes the first step towards silence is to notice all the noise, but to notice it peacefully. Notice it. Don't get agitated. Just try to notice what's happening. When we notice what's happening in a peaceful way, that's the beginning of silence, because we are taking away its power. We're taking away its power, taking away the power of the noise by noticing it, which is really funny. When we don't notice it, or when we're fighting it, we're feeding it. Mm-hmm. When we're not noticing all these places clamoring for our attention, they're masquerading as God, small g. Or if we're fighting it, we're going to lose, because they're stronger than we are. They're plugged in, we're not, you know. And so after 2 or 3 hours after fighting that, we'll die of exhaustion. I'll die of exhaustion. And so fighting it face on face, face to face, we're not going to get much further. But if we take a step back and just notice it in a peaceful way, and the more peaceful way we can notice it, the better it is for us to enter the beginning of this silence. And from that place, whatever we might be doing, are we driving? Are we at work doing things? Are we alone at home just to pray? Whatever we discern in that moment to do, trusting it's in the presence of God and God's with us, and in fact enjoying it with us, is the beginning of prayer. So today coming up, we had some of the worst rain I've seen in years, and driving was nerve-wracking. Going up from Cape Cod, driving on the highways, and then getting up to Boston, and then you can't see. It's like, there's so much rain, it's almost like fog. It's that bad. But you couldn't stop because everybody was driving. And thank God not everybody was driving super fast, but you were forced to move because you were in the middle of traffic, all going the same direction. And what I asked myself, okay, what do I have to do? How do I not drive hypervigilantly? That's hypervigilance, when you're like on guard all the time and you're waiting for the shoe or some shoe to drop, which could end your life. I mean, it was that bad. I wound up actually doing something like that. Just, okay, notice everything. Notice the rain. Notice the trucks going by. Notice the cars next to you. Notice that, but be peaceful as much as you can. And by doing that, I found myself almost driving in a state of rest, you know, because then I was able to prioritize, to drive in a restful way. It was challenging, but to drive in a restful way with God being present. And that, for me, might have been the beginning of prayer.
That's interesting. I always remember this expression by Basil the Great. He says that there will be time where monks will be in the world. When I read this, I was maybe 20, and I had a different understanding of it. I was thinking maybe people will still get married, but they will live monastic life. maybe they will not get married, but they will live in a society, but live like they were living. But I never thought about it in a way that there will be so many things forced on you, and you have to still survive. When he said monks, he didn't mean the way that he was living or his brothers were living in the neighbor cells. He meant somebody who is walking straight towards God, or carrying the cross and not putting it down ever.
I think there's many nuances to that. I think your sense that he had that in mind feels right to me. At the same time, I think of St. Basil, and lately I've been studying his life again. And he might have also intuited himself, because in his later years, because of the earthquake, he was one of the strongest leaders at the rescue efforts and the rebuilding efforts. But what separated him from others is he wasn't just trying to help the Christians. He was trying to help the Jewish quarter of the city. He was trying to help the pagan quarter of the city. He was trying to even help the Arian part of the city. Now, the Arians and the Orthodox Christians, or the Catholic Christians, were not on good terms, because they were having a long dispute about who Christ was. But he helped all the quarters of the city in the rescue efforts and in the rebuilding efforts, to the point of he died at age 49 of exhaustion. And so this is the same St. Basil the Great who wrote all these tomes, who wrote this beautiful theology. He died of exhaustion. I think there's a lot in common between St. Basil the Great and Mother Teresa when you sort of think about their lives. When St. Basil died, let me talk about St. Basil just for a second, because most people don't know this. I might have mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. That when he died, the people in his city were so surprised. They were so incredulous that he died. There was rioting in the streets. Not only rioting in the streets in the Christian quarter, but in the Jewish quarter, and in the pagan quarter, and in the Arian quarter. They were rioting in the streets. Everybody was rioting in the streets out of grief and sadness for their father, who had gone way out of their way to try to help bring them solace and consolation through very bad times. And so he's one of the fastest canonized saints in Christian history. He was made a saint within a few months. He was recognized internationally, let's say, by the Catholic Church, by the Church Catholic, as a saint because of that. And so this says a lot about what it means to be doing what's real for you. We talked about this in our previous episode a little bit, when the time comes.
And it kind of ties these two lines that I read in the beginning, that prayer, faith, love, and then the last one is action. In other words, now for my understanding is prayer, faith, or love are not self-contained. They are not for their own sake, but they are for the sake of the action. And we see in the life of Basil the Great, and also as today's topic, we're talking about Mother Teresa and her prayer, we see in her life. So when we are silent, when we cut ourselves off from the noise and chaos, then we start praying, we kind of get onto the truck, on the right track.
On the right track, right.
Yeah, and then faith comes, love comes, and then we have to act, something to do.
And that implies discerning. Action comes last after all these other previous important phases of being authentic in the presence of God occur. Action without all that is often not very fruitful, or will not be as fruitful as it can be. There are a number of Orthodox, and I have to say I was one of them at one point. Now, maybe it was because when I first came to seminary, I wanted to be the best Orthodox, and so I went through a phase of, what is the strictest, what is the best, what is the highest, that's right. And I still, I think, am like that. But, it's good to have mercy. When you have mercy and your heart of love grows, then all these same principles grow too, So it's not like I've changed my mind, but there's more than just looking like a hardliner on the outside. But there are some people who proudly consider themselves Orthodox hardliners, that when they hear Mother Teresa, or when they hear Saint Francis of Assisi, they'll politely roll their eyes, or they'll, poo-poo, look the other way, and they'll brush their witness off, which, okay, I think there might be a time when it's important to enter more deeply into your own tradition, to learn more about the Lord that way before you reach out to others. That's real too. So maybe some are at that place. But we can't stay at that place. I'm disappointed that many of us Orthodox have not more seriously considered her witness. The more I look into her witness, and I've admired her from afar. And so whenever I would see documentaries on television, whenever I would see something on the internet, if a book or a magazine or an article comes my way, I would read it. But now, thankfully, because of these interviews, I'm going out and doing a little bit more research on my own, and for every little bit I do, I'm rewarded 10 times back. Mm-hmm. And what I'm learning is the more I read what she writes about prayer, about sacrifice, about love, the more she is really in line with the ascetic spirituality that we Eastern Orthodox Christians love to promote and share with others. She's really very much in line with that. It wasn't an accident that St. Basil the Great came to our attention today, because in some ways he was doing in his day as a bishop of the church.
He was the establisher of the hospitals.
He established hospitals, he established his monastery, he established other monasteries, and also sacrificed himself to the point of exhaustion for all the people of his city, not just his Christian flock. That's an amazing witness. And Mother Teresa's witness, to me, feels very similar.
Like St. Basil helped everyone else, and Mother Teresa acted like she was Hindu. She worked with these people like they were her brothers and sisters, and did not ever mention her difference from them. In the opposite, she wanted always to emphasize that they were relating, they were the same. I remember a few stories from her book that even the Prime Minister visited her, and she had to take him to the chapel first and ask to give respect to the master of the house. That's what she says. That's what she says her principle is. If the guests or anybody enters to the hospital or the place where they were treating the orphans at the moment, is to go to the chapel and give respect to the master.
So she's using language from their culture and religious tradition to honor Christ.
Yes. So she always went there first and bowed down in front of the altar, prayed, and didn't ask anybody to do the same thing, because most of the time I assume they were from different religions. But there was just one nuance that she put in there to emphasize that all this is not because of itself, but it's because of Christ. And that's who is treated here, not anyone else. And we have to respect that. Now I want to have a little detour. Mm-hmm. We're going to keep one of the words in our mind, which is the prayer, and we're going to go to another expression that she uses, saying, a family that prays together stays together. As a professional in a family counseling field, I would like you to speak about a little bit about this. Silence is a very important point. She doesn't say a family that is silent together stays together. She says prays together, which is kind of already the second step. But silence has to do a lot. If the family is chaotic, everybody goes their own direction. And I'm going to remember a couple things from our class that I take, where you're teaching, that fact of bidding, where we learn that if there is 60% bidding, then the family stays together, the husband and the wife stay together. And it cannot be done in a chaos. You cannot respond to your spouse in a chaos. There has to be some kind of order or silence where you can respond. And then you can pray together. Otherwise, you wouldn't be praying together.
To get to that stage of prayer means a lot has already happened.
Yes.
And so the prayer is helping sustain that work of staying together, and then whatever that work is, with there's more prayer, it's like a cycle, a healthy cycle of growth for the family. And so I'm still thinking about the beginning of that line, the fruit of silence is prayer. And I'll go back to that another minute.
Yes.
But we can keep expanding what that silence means. It's not only being quiet, it's being receptive, it's listening, it's being still. it's a kind of rest. To be silent is not just to shut up and bite your tongue. Sometimes we have to do that. It might be the first step as we sort of get more peaceful. But entering into that kind of silence is entering into a kind of peaceful attention where we're no longer reacting, but we are being still and relaxed. There's a kind of relaxed fullness in this silence. The kind of silence that she's implying, the kind of silence that the prayers of the church, that the ascetics of the church, East and West, are bearing witness to, is this full silence of awareness. It's a supple, rich, quiet presence that we rest in. And then from there, we more intentionally connect with the other, capital O, other. And so just listening to one another with a restful heart, with an attentive but restful heart, changes everything. My husband and I, when we want to talk, I realize that, especially lately when we're frustrated or we're doing many things, the two of us, that we sometimes have to take a deliberate half a minute to sort of just be quiet with each other, to find words from a quieter, more authentic, more direct, more accurate place where we are a little more vulnerable. Because to be present means to also be vulnerable. That's what receptive means, that we can be penetrated by anything, but we're striving to be penetrated by the good.
When you brought that example of being silent a minute in your family to start sharing, I remember there was a rule in the German army that if somebody was hurt or abused or whatever, they couldn't provoke against it or go to the officers and complain about it 2 or 3 days. They could do it freely after so many days. And that kind of gave them room to sit with it, to be silent with it, look at the elephant from all the sides and see what's going on.
Very good.
And then it says that many of them did not come back after a couple of days. They realized it wasn't really worth it to complain about. And I really want to go into the family, to take this one line into the family life, because it's the most endangered institution. You know better than anyone else, I think, how hurting the family union is in the modern society. You mentioned about silence. Just because people shut their mouth, it's not the silence that we need. At the moment came to my mind that there can be silence but high voltage electricity in the room, where you go in and you feel nobody's talking, but you don't want to be there.
Well, one of my favorite expressions is Saint Cassiani from the 9th, 10th century, an abbess in Constantinople, and there's a whole body of writing with her sayings. Now, scholars are not sure it came from Saint Cassiani, but these sayings are ascribed to her, so it's either these are sayings that she said or are sayings that people close to her believe she said. So she still gets the credit. And there are several that I like. Some are kind of naughty. I'll say one of the naughty ones. One of the naughty ones, it begins with the Greek word miso, which means I despise or I hate. She says, miso, I despise neophytes who theologize. A neophyte refers, at least at that time, there still might have been adults received into Christianity at that point. Adult baptism was very common in the ancient church. By the 9th or 10th century, it was less common, but not impossible. So she might be still referring to adults who become Christian, who, in the first few years of their being Christian, were spouting off theology. She also may be referring to neophytes to ministry, who recently commissioned, and having had all their education, had all their formation, be it in the monastery or at some other institution, who were a little bit too full of themselves, jumping to conclusions theologically. And so she would say, miso, I despise neophytes who theologize. And I think that says something about the thinking of the church, the consciousness of the church, that when someone joins the church, for example, or even when someone joins the monastery, or even when someone goes to seminary, one of the first things they taught all the new 7-year seminary students, and I was one of those 7-year, I was the first woman in the program for the 7 years. They took all us newbies into the cafeteria, and we all sat around a table, and the older upperclassmen were telling us some of the rules. Now that you're here, you're going to follow the rules. A, you defend the tradition. And we'll tell you what the tradition is, but you defend the tradition of the church. And we said, aye, aye. I think I've said that to you in the past. But another thing they said was, all of you say nothing for your first 2 and preferably 3 years of your 7 years here. And what we mean by say nothing is you can ask questions, but that's it. You say nothing about the church. You say nothing about theology. You say nothing about the fathers. You say nothing about anything regarding Christianity that puts you in a teaching position for your first 2 or 3 years in seminary. But you can ask all the questions you want. After that, we'll see. That little principle also is common in the monastic life. When someone comes into the monastery, they're often interviewed by the abbot or the abbess to find out what their strengths are. And so for the first few years, often the new person in monasticism would be put in ministries of service that were coming out of their weaknesses. So if someone was a scholar, they'd be put in the kitchen. If someone was a great cook, they'd put them in the library. And so, which would put the person into a turmoil, but a good turmoil, where they would be forced to look at themselves anew in a new context of being Christian from this perspective. So this is a way of thinking that's very prevalent in the Eastern Church's thinking even now. The other principle that St. Cassiani was very respected for is the expression, I despise silence, miso again, when it is time to speak. That there is a time to speak and there is a time to speak up. When we don't speak up, we may be enabling a bad situation. We may be giving, the silence feeds the oppressor. We were saying in the previous episode, or was it earlier in this episode, I'm not sure, about Hitler. When Hitler was trying to take over the world in his imagination, it started in his imagination, and then it grew to his friends around him, it grew around his community, it grew to his city, and it grew to his political party, and it grew to his country. So it kept that circle of conquest and power mongering, kept growing and growing, so that it kept feeding on itself. Very few people spoke up against it. A lot of people saw it happening, but they looked the other way. They minded their own business, hoping it would go away, or maybe thinking, give him enough rope and he'll hang himself. Maybe. Maybe that's how, one reason why because sometimes people do hang themselves. But in this situation, maybe that's what happened, but it took World War II for it to happen. And so because people did not speak up sooner, World War II occurred.
And the same thing can happen in a family. I remember you have mentioned a few times that people come to therapy very late.
The work of Dr. John Gottman says that 67% of the time when troubled marriages come for counseling, they end up in divorce. Why? Because they usually come at least 6 years too late. Not because it wouldn't have helped, but they came too late. And so that's a little wake-up call for the rest of us who, gee, we might need to talk to somebody a few years earlier than that 6-year point of no return to expose where we're hardened and where we need to soften and to develop muscles that have atrophied to get stronger in order to make us more whole people and help our families become more whole.
So can we call this 6 years unhealthy silence, or there is noise going on there?
Both.
Both.
The bad I guess the bad noise from the fighting and the disagreements, and that icy, sad silence or cold war that happens when we just dig in our heels and refuse to talk about it, or we're too afraid to talk about it because we're afraid of the explosions and the price that will be paid. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, one or the other person can be a tyrant in the relationship. That needs to be looked at. And
what kind of silence would you suggest in this kind of situation that will lead to prayer rather than explosion or divorce? Or is there some kind of silence where
there's fear and intimidation in the family going on? Mm-hmm. I'm not saying normal arguments, but even with normal arguments, it is healthy to take some time away, to go cool off, go to another part of the house, go visit a friend, go for a ride in the car, or the streetcar. It might be cheaper now with the gas being so expensive. But to find a way to be alone with one's own thoughts and claim one's experience in the presence of God. Oftentimes when we're in the turmoil of argument, we can't even name what's upsetting us. And so just to find a place where we can name what we're feeling, be peaceful with it in the presence of God so that we can articulate to our own selves in the presence of God what is going wrong is an immense advantage, provides us with a lot of direction where we could go next. And then we have to go next someplace, we ask for help.
So this would be the healthy silence.
That's a healthy silence.
Both sides, or many sides in the family who are in this bad situation would need to address. So even before the wonderful speech that Saint Cassiani is telling us,
right?
Hoping for, needs some prior silence to
discern,
to see what you're going to say.
Right. To do it peacefully, authentically, in a way that's as honest from our experience as possible. And then we pick up the 500-pound phone and we call someone we trust and talk about it with them. We pray about it. We could even talk about it with our spouse or other family members if conditions allow.
Thank you, Presbyter. Especially the last piece was my favorite because I have been paying attention to family life for quite a bit. And there are so many things that I cannot answer, and I'm looking for answers. And I'm sure that our audience are looking for answers also, and who are blessed to have somebody who has studied and experienced through many people's problems, how it can be solved. When during our classes you mentioned once that these books that we are reading are written from the files that the psychologists have kept in their offices, and then eventually they have published 30 or 40 years of their experience. That's a treasure. And we have a treasure here in your presence, and our audience should be blessed and praying for this kind of experience. Thank you very much. And thank you, dear audience. We are going to continue to every single line of this prayer and get some answers that we won't get anywhere else.